Damian Blackwood did not knock. He walked through the front door of the Monroe property like he already owned it, because, in his mind, he did. He looked at Eliza standing in the kitchen doorway, flour on her hands, her father coughing in the back room, and he smiled the kind of smile that had nothing warm in it. "I came to collect," he said. "Every cent your father borrowed, due today." Eliza didn't move. The agreement said end of month. Agreements change. He looked her up and down slowly, deliberately, the way a man looks at something he considers beneath him. "Besides, who's going to argue for you? Your father can barely breathe, and you—" He almost laughed. "You're not exactly the kind of woman men fight for, are you?" The room went completely silent, except for her father's coughing from behind the wall. And in that silence, something shifted inside Eliza Monroe. Something that had been bending for years finally decided it was done bending. What? If you've ever been told you weren't worth fighting for, stay with me. Because this story is about what happens when the wrong woman finally decides she's had enough. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week we bring you stories like this one, stories about courage, survival, and the people nobody expected to matter. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Motown, Part 1. The town of Garvey's Crossing sat at the base of the Blue Spine Mountains like something that had been dropped there by accident and never moved. It wasn't a pretty town. It wasn't a proud town. It was the kind of place where people stayed because leaving took money they didn't have, and staying took a kind of stubbornness that eventually became indistinguishable from courage. Eliza Monroe had lived there her entire 28 years. She knew every face, every fence post, every stretch of cracked soil between the edge of town and the creek that dried up every August. She knew which neighbors would loan you a cup of cornmeal without making you feel like a beggar, and which ones would smile to your face and talk behind your back before you'd even cleared their porch steps. She also knew, without anyone having to say it plainly, what most of Garvey's Crossing thought of her. It wasn't a secret. It had never been a secret. When you're a large woman in a small town, the commentary tends to come without invitation. In the dry goods store, from the women who gathered near the bolts of fabric. In the street, from men who didn't bother to lower their voices. In church, in the careful way certain people looked at the floor when she walked past, as though eye contact might obligate them to be decent. Lazy. That was the word they used most. As if the size of a woman's body told you everything you needed to know about the content of her character. What they didn't see, what they couldn't be bothered to see, was what happened before sunrise every morning at the Monroe Ranch. Eliza was up before the rooster settled into its noise. She fed the animals, checked the fence lines, hauled water from the well because the pump had been broken for 2 years and there was no money to fix it. She kept the accounts, handled the suppliers, wrote letters on her father's behalf when his hands shook too badly to hold a pen. She had taught herself to stretch a week's worth of provisions into 10 days, to repair leather harness with strips of rawhide and patience, to read a contract carefully enough to spot the line where someone was trying to cheat you. Her father, Harold Monroe, had been a capable rancher once, strong, clear-eyed, sharp in a trade. But the illness had come on slowly over 4 years, a persistent cough that settled deeper and deeper into his chest until it became something that couldn't be ignored or reasoned away. The doctor in town had a name for it. The name didn't matter much. What mattered was that Harold Monroe was not going to get better, and both he and Eliza understood that without either of them saying it out loud. What they talked about instead was the debt. Harold had borrowed money 3 years ago from a man named Damian Blackwood, who operated the lending office on the east end of Main Street. The terms had seemed reasonable at the time, reasonable enough that Harold had signed, which was the first mistake. Damian Blackwood's terms were never reasonable. They were constructed to appear reasonable until the moment came when they weren't, and by then you'd already signed. The original sum was manageable, but there were fees Harold hadn't anticipated, and a bad season that left them short, and an interest clause that Damian had explained away with a wave of his hand during the signing. Now the number sitting in Eliza's account book was not manageable. It was the kind of number that meant the ranch. She had been working the numbers for weeks, looking for a way through. There wasn't one. Not on the timeline Damian had set. She was still staring at the account book on the morning Damien walked through their door without knocking. Eliza had been expecting him, not that morning specifically, but the visit in general. She'd been expecting it the way you expect a storm when the sky turns a certain color. You can see it coming, you just can't stop it. He came in like a man who had already decided the outcome of every conversation before it started. Pressed coat, clean boots, the smell of pomade on his hair. He was Nathaniel Blackwood's uncle by blood, but the family resemblance ended there. Damien had the kind of face that looked generous in the right light and revealed itself as something else entirely when he smiled. He looked at Eliza the way he always looked at her. That slow, deliberate inventory that wasn't interest, it was dismissal. The kind of look that said, I'm not seeing a person. I'm seeing an obstacle, or possibly a joke. Every cent, he said, due today. The agreement said end of month, Eliza told him. Her voice was steady. She had practiced being steady for so many years that it came automatically now, like breathing. Agreements change. He said it like it was obvious, like she was slow for not having already understood this. Then he looked her over again, that slow sweep, and the corner of his mouth moved. Besides, who's going to argue for you? Your father can barely breathe, and you— A pause filled with something she had no name for except cruelty dressed up as observation. You're not exactly the kind of woman men fight for, are you? Behind the wall, her father coughed. Eliza stood very still. She had heard variations of that sentence her entire life. She knew the weight of it. She knew the exact way it was meant to land, not just as an insult, but as a reminder of her place, which in Damien Blackwood's estimation was somewhere below the furniture and slightly above the inconvenient. What he didn't know, what none of them ever knew, was that Eliza Monroe kept a very specific kind of anger. Not the loud kind that made you feel better in the short term and worse in the long term. She kept the quiet kind, the kind that waited, the kind that remembered every single word and filed it somewhere useful. She looked at him directly and said, You'll have the first installment by end of week, in writing. I'll bring it to your office. Something moved across Damien's face. Surprise, maybe, or irritation that she hadn't crumpled the way he expected. First installment isn't the contract, Eliza said, which I have read 3 times, including the addendum on page 4, allows for installment repayment provided. The first payment is received within 30 days of the original due date. Today is day 26. I have 4 days. She held his gaze. So I'll see you end of week. Damien Blackwood looked at her for a long moment. The smile was gone. In its place was something colder, more evaluating, like he was reconsidering what kind of obstacle she was. Then he turned and walked out. Didn't say goodbye. Men like Damien never did. Eliza stood in the kitchen doorway until she heard his horse move away from the property. Then she sat down at the table, put both hands flat on the wood, and breathed. She did not have the money for the first installment. She did not have a plan for getting it. What she had was 4 days and a very clear understanding of exactly how bad things were. Her father called from the back room. Liza, who was that? Nobody, she said. Rest, Papa. She opened the account book and stared at the numbers as if staring hard enough might change them. It didn't. The next morning, she went to the bank. She already knew what they would say because she had been to the bank before, and she had also had the conversation where the banker, a soft-handed man named Prentice, who had never done a day of physical labor in his life, explained with great patience that the Monroe property, while valuable in theory, did not present sufficient collateral given the existing debt load and the current health status of its primary owner, meaning Harold, whose illness was, Prentice said with genuine-sounding sympathy, a complicating factor. What Prentice was actually saying, in the language men used when they wanted to say something unkind without appearing unkind, was, You don't have enough, you are not enough, and there is nothing here worth the risk. She left the bank and stood on the wooden walkway outside and looked down the length of Main Street and did the arithmetic in her head one more time. The arithmetic came out the same way it always did. She needed a solution that didn't exist. She went home and made soup from the last of the dried beans and sat with her father while he ate, and she talked to him about nothing important, about the weather turning, about the bay mare's hoof that was healing up nicely, about a letter she'd gotten from a cousin in the East who had found work in a textile mill. Harold Monroe watched his daughter talk and eat and pretend everything was fine, and after a while he said quietly, How bad is it? Eliza didn't insult him by pretending not to know what he meant. "We'll figure it out," she said. He looked at her with his tired eyes. "I know you will," he said. "That's what worries me." She understood what he meant. He meant, "I know you'll find a way, but I'm afraid of what it will cost you." He meant, "You've already given too much." He meant, "I'm sorry." She squeezed his hand and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say. 2 days later, the stranger arrived in Garvey's Crossing. She first saw him from the window of the dry goods store, where she was trying to make a week's worth of decisions with 3 days' worth of money. He came up the main road on a large gray horse, not a flashy animal, just solid and well kept, the kind of horse that suggested its owner was practical rather than show. The man himself was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that came from years outdoors rather than from age. He wore plain clothes, worn but not ragged. Nothing about him announced anything. He stopped at the post office first, then the livery. He moved through town quietly, without drawing attention the way he would have if he'd been trying not to draw attention. He wasn't trying for anything. He was just methodical, like a man who moved through the world the same way regardless of who was watching. Eliza noticed him the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit the pattern of ordinary things, and then she went back to her arithmetic and forgot about him. She didn't forget for long. That evening, there was a knock at the Monroe door. A real knock, the kind that asked permission instead of assuming it. When she opened the door, the stranger was standing on the porch with his hat in his hands. "Miss Monroe," he said. She stared at him. "I don't know you." "No," he said, "but I know something about your situation." He said it without apology, without embarrassment, matter of fact, like it was information rather than intrusion. "My name is Nathaniel Blackwood. Damien is my uncle. I heard what he did when he came here." Eliza's hand tightened on the doorframe. "How?" "Small town," he said simply. "Word moves." She studied him. He didn't look away. He also didn't look at her the way most men looked at her, that quick appraisal and dismissal. He just looked at her face, like that was the relevant part. "What do you want?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding how to say something, not whether to say it. "I have a proposal," he said finally. "A practical one. I won't dress it up as something it isn't." He paused. "I need a wife. I need someone with a specific set of qualities that I haven't found in the usual places people look. I've heard about you, not from gossip, from the feed store owner who says you can stretch a supply budget better than anyone he's dealt with, from the postal clerk who says you write the clearest letters he's ever handled, from Bill Cord at the livestock pen who says you can read an animal's condition faster than most men who've been ranching all their lives." Eliza said nothing. "I'll pay every debt your family owes to my uncle," Nathaniel said. "Today, in full. I'll also ensure your father has medical care and that this property is protected in his name for as long as he lives. In return, you come with me, as my wife." The silence stretched between them. "You're proposing marriage," Eliza said, to make sure she'd understood correctly. "I am. To a woman you've never met. To a woman who has the qualities I need," he said. "Yes." She stared at him. There were 100 questions in her head and she sorted through them, discarding the ones that were fear dressed up as logic, until she found the one that actually mattered. "Why me specifically?" For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, something more careful. "Because," he said, "I've been watching Garvey's Crossing for 3 days, and you're the only person in it who's been working harder than they're letting on." She didn't know what to do with that. She also didn't know what to do with the fact that it was true. Behind her, her father coughed again, a long, rattling string of it that went on too long. Eliza looked back at the dim interior of the house, at the account book on the table, at the walls that were starting to show where the weather had gotten in. Then she looked back at Nathaniel Blackwood, standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, waiting. "Give me tonight," she said. He nodded. "I'll be at the boarding house." He left without fanfare, the same way he'd arrived. She stood in the doorway watching him go, and she had the strange sensation of standing at the edge of something, a cliff, a river, some threshold that once you crossed, you didn't cross back. She went inside. She sat at the table. She did not open the account book. She thought about what it meant to be a woman in Garvey's Crossing with a father too sick to work and a debt that was going to swallow them whole. She thought about Damien's face that morning in her kitchen, the slow look, the half smile. She thought about Prentice at the bank with his soft hands and his sympathetic voice. Then she thought about the feed store owner she barely knew, apparently telling a stranger that she was good with numbers. The postal clerk who noticed the quality of her letters. Bill Cord, who had never once said anything like that to her face. She sat with that for a long time. In the morning, she woke her father early and told him, simply and plainly, what had happened and what she was considering. Harold Monroe listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "You don't have to do this for me," he said. "I know," she said. "That's not the only reason." He looked at her for a long moment. "What's the other reason?" She thought about Damien's face. She thought about the look. She thought about every variation of that look she'd received in 28 years of living in a town that had already decided what she was worth. "I want to find out," she said, "if he's right." Harold didn't ask what she meant. He understood her the way fathers sometimes understood daughters, not through words, but through the longer knowledge of having watched her become who she was. "Go," he said softly. "Go find out." She went to the boarding house before the town was properly awake, because she did not want an audience for this. She knocked on the door they told her was his, and he answered quickly, like he hadn't been sleeping either. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He did not look triumphant. He looked, if anything, relieved in a way that was more complicated than she'd expected. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me," he said. And she did. Every one of them. She stood in the doorway of that boarding house room and laid out every term she required. Her father's care, the property deed, a written agreement before any ceremony, the right to return if he misrepresented himself or the situation. She spoke clearly and without apology, the same way she read contracts and managed accounts, and did everything else she'd ever done that the town had somehow failed to notice. When she finished, Nathaniel Blackwood was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Those are fair terms. All of them." She studied his face, looking for the lie. She was very good at finding lies by now. She'd had a lot of practice. She didn't find one. "Then we have a deal," she said. He nodded. She turned to walk back down the hall, and behind her she heard him say quietly, "Miss Monroe." She stopped. "The town is going to talk," he said. "The town," she said without turning around, "has always talked." She went home to pack what mattered, leaving everything else behind, and tried very hard not to think about what she was walking toward, and what she was walking away from, and whether the line between bravery and desperation was something you could actually see from where you were standing, or only from a long distance after the fact. They left before full light. Eliza had told herself she wouldn't look back at the house, and she didn't. Not because she wasn't tempted, but because she knew herself well enough to know that if she looked back at her father standing in the doorway with his worn coat pulled around his shoulders in the early cold, she might not be able to keep moving. So she looked straight ahead, at the gray horse Nathaniel rode and the smaller roan mare he'd arranged for her, and she focused on the mechanics of it, stirrup, reins, posture, the same way she focused on numbers when emotion threatened to make them blur. They didn't talk much in the first hour. The trail out of Garvey's Crossing moved north and then curved hard west toward the mountain range that most people in town treated as a wall rather than a road. The Blue Spine, they called it. The name wasn't poetic, it was accurate. The ridgeline looked like something vertebral, something that had pushed up through the earth out of pure stubbornness. People in the valley said nothing useful lived up there. They said that with the confidence of people who had never gone to check. Nathaniel rode slightly ahead, not because he was leading in any pointed way, just because he knew the trail, and she didn't. Every so often he would glance back, not to check on her in the way men checked on women they considered fragile, but the way you check on someone you're responsible for when the terrain gets uncertain. It was a practical kind of attention, and Eliza found that she didn't mind it. By mid-morning, the trail had narrowed to something that was barely a trail at all, more of a suggestion. Rocky, uneven, the kind of ground where a horse had to think about each step. Eliza had ridden her whole life, but she'd ridden flat valley land, not this. Her thighs ached. Her back was starting to make itself known. She didn't say anything about it. Nathaniel pulled up at a wide, flat stone beside a thin thread of creek and dismounted without ceremony. "We'll stop," he said. Not asking, but not ordering either, just stating what was going to happen. They watered the horses and Eliza stretched her legs and pretended she wasn't doing it because everything hurt. Nathaniel produced dried biscuits and hard cheese from his saddlebag and handed her a portion without making it a gesture. She ate without comment. After a while, she said, "You could have told me more before we left." He looked at her. "About what?" "About where we're going, what I'm riding into." She kept her voice level. "You said you had a property. You didn't say how far." "2 more days," he said. "Maybe 2.5 if the weather moves in." She absorbed that. "And the property itself? What is it?" He was quiet a moment. Not evasive. She was getting a feel for the difference between Nathaniel being evasive and Nathaniel actually thinking before he spoke. The pause, she was learning, was usually the second thing. "It's substantial," he said. "That's not a description." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He was looking at the creek. "I'll tell you more when we're closer. Some things are better seen than explained." She considered pushing. She decided against it. Not because she was deferring to him, but because she was making a tactical decision. She didn't have enough information yet to know which questions would get her useful answers. She needed more data first. "Fine," she said, "but understand that I don't like surprises." "I know," he said. "You don't know anything about me." "I know more than you think," he said, not smugly, just accurately. "And you know more about me than you realize, too, if you think about what you've observed instead of what you've been told." She looked at him sideways. "That's a strange thing to say. Is it wrong?" She thought about it honestly. In the short time since he'd appeared on her porch, she had filed away quite a few things. The quality of his gear, which was functional rather than decorative. The way he'd listened when she laid out her conditions, not with the patience of a man waiting for a woman to finish talking, but the attention of someone genuinely processing terms. The fact that he hadn't tried once to soften the arrangement with flattery or romance. He'd been honest about what he wanted and why. In Eliza's experience, that kind of honesty was rarer than people like to claim. "No," she said finally. "It's not wrong." They remounted and rode on. By late afternoon, the trees had changed from the familiar scrub oak of the valley to pine, tall and close set, and the air had cooled by 10 degrees. The light came through in columns, and the ground was soft with needlefall. It was beautiful in the way that wild places were beautiful, indifferently, without any interest in being appreciated. That night they camped where the trail widened near a rock shelf that blocked the wind from the north. Nathaniel built a fire with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times and had no patience left for making it look effortless. It wasn't effortless. He got ash on his sleeve and swore under his breath, and Eliza caught it, and for some reason it made her feel better about the whole situation. She arranged her bedroll on the other side of the fire and lay looking up at the pine canopy. The stars were very bright up here, brighter than they'd ever been in the valley. She lay there and thought about her father's face in the doorway that morning, and then made herself stop thinking about it. "Nathaniel," she said. "Why haven't you asked about me?" A pause. "What do you mean?" "You told me what you'd heard from the feed store, from the clerk, from Bill Cord." She stared at the stars. "But you haven't asked me anything directly. Most people, when they're trying to get to know someone, ask questions." "Most people ask questions," he said slowly, "when they're trying to confirm what they already want to believe." A beat. "I'm not trying to confirm anything. I'd rather watch and see what's actually there." Eliza processed that. It was uncomfortable in the way that accurate observations sometimes were. "That could also be a strategy," she said, "letting someone think you're not observing them while you observe them." He didn't answer for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It could be." She turned her head to look across the fire at him. He was lying on his back with one arm behind his head, staring at the same sky. "Are you?" she asked. "Probably some of both," he said. "I'm not sure I know how to fully separate them." It was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years, which was a low bar, given her recent history with Damian Blackwood and Prentice the banker, but still. She closed her eyes. Sleep came slowly, and then all at once, the way it did when you were more tired than you'd admitted. The second day was harder. The trail climbed steadily through the morning, and the horses worked for every step of it. Eliza's roan was game, but not young, and she had to be managed carefully over the loose shale sections. Eliza did manage her, carefully, patiently, making the small adjustments that kept the animal's confidence up. Nathaniel watched this without commenting, but she noticed him watching. Around noon, they crossed a ridgeline, and the wind hit them with a force that hadn't been present down in the trees. It was sharp, high-altitude cold, and Eliza tucked her chin and rode into it and refused to acknowledge that her eyes were watering, which might have been the wind and might have been something else. Below the ridge on the far side, the slope dropped into a long valley that was still mostly in shadow. From up here, she could see the shape of it, wide and bowl-like, protected on three sides by the mountain ridges. A river caught the light somewhere at the bottom. "How much farther?" she asked, raising her voice over the wind. "Tomorrow morning," Nathaniel said. "We'll drop into the valley today and camp at the base." She nodded, and they went down. The descent took 2 hours and was, in some ways, harder than the climb. Eliza's knees ached with the sustained effort of keeping her weight back and letting the horse work. She didn't complain. At the bottom, the temperature came back up 20 degrees and the air smelled of pine resin and river water. They made camp in a clearing near the river. Eliza unsaddled her own horse without being asked, checked her hooves, worked out a small stone that had found its way into the left front, and then let her graze. When she straightened up and turned around, Nathaniel was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. Then, because apparently he had decided honesty was just his mode of operation, "You're good with horses." "I know I'm good with horses," she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen to it. "I'm noticing things," he said. "Like I said." "And what are you noticing?" He seemed to consider the question seriously. "That you check the horse before you check yourself," he said. "That you know which problems to fix and which to just manage. That you don't spend energy on things that don't matter." A pause. "Those are useful qualities." "Useful," she repeated. "You have a way of making everything sound like an inventory." "Probably," he said. "I've been doing that a long time." "What happened?" she asked. Because something had to have happened to make a man turn everything, including a marriage, including a woman, including human connection, into a practical accounting of assets and liabilities. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "My brother," he said finally. "He died 4 years ago. He was supposed to run the operation. He understood people in a way that I don't." He paused. "I understand systems, logistics, what needs doing. He understood why people do things, what they need to feel, how to bring them along with you." He looked at the river. "When he was gone, there was no one to do the part he did. I've been trying to cover it with systems ever since. It doesn't fully work." Eliza sat with that. It was more than she'd expected, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. "What was his name?" she asked. "Thomas," he said. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded, not dismissively, with the nod of someone who has heard those words enough times that they no longer expect them to do much, but who recognizes when they're meant. They ate in relative quiet, and she lay down to sleep with the sound of the river underneath everything, and she thought about what it meant to love someone who organized the world into systems, because feeling things too directly had become too costly. She'd met people like that before. She understood the architecture of it, even if she'd never built it herself. The third morning, they broke camp while the sky was still purple. For the first hour, the trail moved through dense pine, and she couldn't see much beyond the trees on either side. Then the trail curved and curved again and came out through a narrow pass between two rock faces that squeezed close enough that she could have touched both walls with her arms spread. And then the pass opened. Eliza pulled up her horse without meaning to. Her hand tightened on the reins involuntarily, and the roan stopped and stood. Below her, in the wide bowl of the valley she'd glimpsed from the ridge, was something that should not have been there. Not by any logic she'd applied to this journey. Not by anything Nathaniel had said or implied or allowed her to imagine. It was not a cabin. It was not a rough frontier homestead. It was not anything resembling the operation of a man who traveled alone with worn clothes and ate dried biscuits on the trail. There were structures, large ones, built with timber and stone, arranged in a pattern that showed planning rather than piecemeal addition. There were barns that could have held 40 horses each, and there were workers moving between them with the purposeful movement of people who had jobs and knew their jobs. There were irrigated fields laid out with precision along the river bottom, crops in rows so orderly they looked measured. There were workshops, storage buildings, a long, low structure that might have been sleeping quarters for staff. There were fences that went on for what must have been miles. And overseeing it all from a slight rise was a house. Not a mansion, not decorated or ornate, but large, solidly built, built to last in a way that meant someone had thought carefully about what lasting meant. Eliza sat on her horse and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Behind her, Nathaniel had come up and stopped. He didn't say anything either. Finally, she said, "You said substantial." "Yes," he said. "That word doesn't cover this." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She turned to look at him. He was watching her face, not triumphantly, not with the satisfaction of a man who'd pulled off a trick. He looked like someone braced for something. For her reaction, maybe. For whatever she was going to say next. "How long?" she asked. "How long what?" "How long has this existed?" 12 years, he said. "I started it when I was 24. With money I earned working for a mining operation up north. Most people thought I was throwing it away on land that wasn't worth having." He paused. "The isolation is intentional. The fewer people who know where it is, the better." "Your uncle," Eliza said. "He knows?" Something moved in Nathaniel's face. "Yes," he said. "He knows. And he told everyone in town you were a struggling mountain man." "Yes." "Why did you let him?" Nathaniel looked out over the valley below. "Because it served me," he said. "An unknown man attracts less attention, less interference." He paused. "And because until recently, it didn't matter what Damien said. He didn't have a reason to cause trouble." "What changed?" Eliza asked. He turned back to her. "A letter from an investor in the East who wants to put money into expanding the operation. A lot of money. Enough to triple the size of everything you're looking at." He held her gaze. "Damien found out. He's been my uncle my entire life. He knows I have no family left to give him legal standing in this operation. No partner. No wife. No one whose interests align with mine from inside the household." He paused. "An unmarried man operating something this size alone is, in the eyes of certain people, an opportunity." Eliza's mind was already moving through the implications. She was doing it the way she did it, quickly, without announcing that she was doing it, cataloging what she now understood that she hadn't understood before. The proposal. The conditions. The haste. "He's going to try to take this from you," she said. "He's already trying," Nathaniel said. "He's been writing to the investor suggesting that I'm unstable, that the operation lacks the kind of grounded, settled leadership that a man of serious capital investment should require." He said it without heat, but the control in his voice was the kind that came from actively applying it. A married man with a capable wife presents differently than a solitary mountain recluse. "That's why you came to Garvey's Crossing. That's part of why." "What's the other part?" He looked at her directly. "I told you on your porch," he said. "I meant it." She held his gaze, looking for the lie again, finding nothing she could clearly name as one. "I'm angry," she said. "I want to say that plainly. I'm angry that you didn't tell me this before we left." "I know," he said. "You let me think I was marrying a man with a modest operation in the mountains." "You would have come with more fear and less clarity," he said. "I needed you clear-headed." "That is not your decision to make about my mental state," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. It wasn't. It wasn't an apology with excuses attached. It was just an acknowledgement. She noted that. "I need to know everything," she said, "all of it. What Damien is planning, who the investor is, what the legal arrangements are for this property, what role you actually need me to play. All of it." "Yes," he said. "Starting tonight." "Starting tonight," he agreed. She looked back at the valley, at the scale of what she'd ridden 2.5 days through mountain wilderness to reach, at the thing that had existed, unknown, while everyone in Garvey's Crossing was busy deciding what she was worth. She thought about Damien's face in her kitchen, the slow look, the half smile, the question he'd asked like it was rhetorical. "Who's going to argue for you?" She felt something shift, somewhere below the anger, something that had no name yet but was taking shape. "All right," she said. "Let's go down." They descended into the valley on a trail that was well maintained, better maintained than anything on the mountain crossing, which meant it was used regularly but not advertised. Workers looked up as they came in. Some nodded. None of them looked particularly surprised to see Nathaniel, but several of them looked at Eliza with the careful attention of people cataloging a change. A man came out of the largest barn as they approached, older, with a gray beard and the permanently squinted eyes of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. He stopped when he saw Eliza and looked at Nathaniel with one raised eyebrow. "This is Eliza Monroe," Nathaniel said. "She'll be my wife." The man said nothing for a moment, then, "Monroe? Harold Monroe's daughter? From over in Garvey's Crossing?" Eliza looked at him. "You know my father?" "Knew him, years ago, before he got sick." The man held out his hand. "Cable Marsh. I run things on the ground here." He shook her hand the way he'd shake a man's, firm, brief, businesslike. "Your father was a straight dealer. I always liked him." "Thank you," she said. Cable looked at Nathaniel again with the eyebrow still slightly elevated, some private communication passing between them that Eliza filed for later. "We'll talk tonight," Nathaniel told him. "Set up the main room." Cable nodded and walked back toward the barn without further commentary. Eliza watched him go. "He doesn't waste words," she said. "No," Nathaniel said, "which is why I trust him." She understood the principle. They stabled the horses. Nathaniel did his own horse, she did hers, no discussion required, and then he walked her to the main house. Inside it was plain and functional, exactly what the outside suggested. Heavy furniture, clean but not decorated. Bookshelves with actual books rather than decorative ones. She could tell because several were flagged with strips of paper and some were stacked horizontally on top of the upright ones, which meant they were being actually used rather than arranged. A large table that served as both a work surface and a dining table. Maps on one wall, tacked up without frames. She stood in the middle of the main room and turned slowly, reading it the way she read everything. "No one's done anything to make this look like someone lives here," she said. "I live here," he said. "You work here," she said. "There's a difference." She wasn't being cruel about it, just accurate. "You sleep here and you eat here. But this room looks like an operations center." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas used to say that," he said. She looked at him. "He used to say it needed a person in it," Nathaniel said. "Not just a purpose." Eliza turned back to the maps on the wall. She walked over and looked at them. The valley's layout, the surrounding terrain, trail markers, property boundaries. Well drawn, detailed, clearly updated over time. "Is this all your land?" she asked. "Everything inside the heavy line," he said, coming to stand beside her. She traced the boundary with her finger. It was enormous, much larger than it had appeared from the pass. And Damien's claim, what's his actual legal argument? "He doesn't have one yet," Nathaniel said, "which is why he's working on the investor instead. If he can convince the investor that I'm not fit to manage this, unstable, unpredictable, no proper establishment, then the investor pulls out. Without that capital, I can't make the next land payment on the eastern acreage." He pointed to a section on the map. "If I default on that payment, it reverts to a territorial land claim, and Damien has already filed a competing claim on it." Eliza stared at the map. Her mind was moving fast now, the way it moved when she had enough pieces to start seeing the shape of a problem. "So he doesn't need to take what you have. He just needs to block you from expanding, trigger a default, and claim the reversion." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "And undermining your personal credibility with the investor is the mechanism." "Yes." "Which means the marriage isn't just about appearance," she said. "It's about the letter of your arrangement with the investor. He requires, what? A settled operation?" "He requires evidence of stable, long-term management," Nathaniel said. His exact words in the correspondence were that he invests in enterprises that show the character of permanence. He's lost money before on frontier operations run by men who cut and ran when things got difficult. He paused. A man with a wife, with a household, with someone who has genuine stake in the outcome, that reads differently to him than a man alone. "What's the investor's name?" Eliza asked. "Arthur Hale. He's based in Philadelphia. He'll be sending a representative out to assess the operation within the next few months. And Damien knows this. Damien knows everything about the investor," Nathaniel said. "He made it his business to know." Eliza stood looking at the map and thought about the geometry of it. Damien's play, Nathaniel's vulnerability, the investor in Philadelphia who held the key to everything. She thought about the compressed timeline. She thought about what she had walked into and what she had not walked into, and where the actual danger lived. "Your uncle," she said. "Will he come here?" Eventually, Nathaniel said. "He's never come while I've been alone. But if he learns about the investor's representative coming, and he will learn, he'll want to be present. He'll want to make his case in person." Eliza thought about Damien's face in her kitchen. The smile. The look. "You're not exactly the kind of woman men fight for." "Good," she said. Nathaniel looked at her. "Let him come," she said. She turned from the map to face him. "Because I have read his contracts, I know his methods. I know what he considers strength and what he considers weakness, and I know exactly the kind of woman he thinks I am." She held Nathaniel's gaze steadily. "He's wrong about all of it, and it will be better for us if he doesn't find that out until it matters." The room was quiet for a moment. Nathaniel looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than most. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man recalculating an estimate that had already been high. "You're not afraid of him," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm absolutely afraid of him," Eliza said. "He's dangerous, and he's unscrupulous, and he's had years to build his position. Fear is appropriate." She paused. "But afraid doesn't mean paralyzed. It just means paying attention." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My brother would have liked you." She didn't know what to do with that, so she turned back to the map. "Show me the eastern acreage," she said, "the land that's at risk, and then show me the financial documents for the default clause." She looked at him sideways. "And then you can explain to me exactly what you need me to do and what you're expecting me to figure out on my own, so we're clear on which is which." He moved to the table and began pulling documents from a flat case she hadn't noticed in the corner. She pulled out the nearest chair and sat down and rolled up her sleeves and waited. Outside, the valley went about its business in the afternoon light. Workers moving between the barns and the fields, the river running south, the mountains standing watch on all four sides. Inside the house that felt like an operations center because it was one, a woman who had been told her whole life that she wasn't worth arguing for, sat down at the table of a man who was about to learn what that woman could do with the right information and enough reason to use it. She looked at the documents he set in front of her and started reading. She read fast, the way she'd always read. Not skimming, but genuinely processing, her eyes moving steadily down each page. Nathaniel sat across from her and watched her read without interrupting, which was either patience or the recognition that interrupting her would be counterproductive. She made occasional marks in the margin with the pencil she'd produced from her pocket, her own pencil, which she'd carried from Garvey's Crossing because she always had one. Cable came in partway through, set coffee on the table without comment, and left. By the time the light outside had shifted to the amber of late afternoon, she had read everything twice and had 3 pages of notes in her cramped, efficient handwriting. "The default clause," she said, not looking up from her notes, "has a 30-day cure period that Damien's version of events doesn't mention." Nathaniel went still. "What?" She looked up. "Page 11 of the Territorial Land Agreement. The reversion clause. There's a cure period, 30 days from the date of formal default notice, where the original claimant can remedy the default and retain the land." She turned the document around and pushed it across the table. "If Damien told you there wasn't, he lied. If his own lawyer told him there wasn't, he needs a new lawyer." Nathaniel leaned forward and read. She watched his face change in real time, the careful control of it shifting, some tension unwinding that had been there long enough she hadn't noticed it as tension until it moved. "I never—" He stopped. "I read this 3 times. "You were reading for the threat," she said. "I was reading for the exit." She paused. It's the same document, different question." He looked at her across the table. "The 30 days buys time," she said, "which changes the investor calculation and the timeline." She looked back at her notes. "It doesn't solve everything, but it means you're not as close to the edge as you thought." The house was quiet. Outside, someone shouted something across the yard and another voice answered, the ordinary sounds of a working operation at the end of a working day. Nathaniel sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she had no ready name for. Not gratitude, which was too simple, and not relief, which was too small. Something more complicated. The look of a man who had been carrying a weight alone for long enough that he'd forgotten what it felt like to set part of it down. "Eliza," he said. "Don't," she said. He waited. "Just tell me what else I need to read," she said. "We have a lot of ground to cover." He nodded. He reached for the next stack of documents and set them in front of her. She picked up her pencil. The wedding happened on a Tuesday. There was no ceremony to speak of, not in any formal sense. A traveling magistrate named Elbert Foss came through the valley on his quarterly circuit, a small, precise man with ink-stained fingers who had married approximately 200 couples across the territory and had long since stopped attaching sentiment to the paperwork. He arrived in the morning, ate breakfast, produced his register, and asked them to confirm the names he'd been given. Nathaniel said yes. Eliza said yes. Foss wrote it down, had Cable Marsh and one of the field hands sign as witnesses, and then accepted a second cup of coffee before riding on to his next stop. That was that. Eliza stood in the yard afterward and looked at the mountains ringing the valley and tried to locate what she felt about it. What she found was mostly practical, a settled quality, like a contract properly executed. The arrangement was real now. That meant something, even if she wasn't sure yet what it meant to her at a level below practical. Nathaniel came to stand beside her, not close, not touching, just present. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. "You?" "Yes," he said. They stood there for a moment in the morning quiet, and then both of them went back to work, because there was work to do, and whatever this was would have to be figured out alongside the work rather than instead of it. The weeks that followed were the hardest education of Eliza's life, and she had not had an easy education. Learning the operation, the actual scope of it, took more than she had anticipated. The valley was not simply a large ranch. Nathaniel had built it in layers over 12 years, adding functions as the original profits-generated capital for expansion. There was the livestock operation, which was the visible core. But underneath that were supply arrangements with 3 mining camps to the north, a timber contract with a territorial road-building project, a seed production system that sold to farms throughout a 100-mile radius, and a network of storage and distribution points that Cowboy managed through a web of contacts. Eliza spent her first 2 weeks simply mapping. She did it with her pencil and her habit of writing things down before she decided what they meant. She walked the operation every morning before most of the workers were up, not to demonstrate anything to anyone, but because she needed to see things with her own eyes rather than through other people's explanations. She checked what matched what the record said and what didn't. She asked Cable questions until he started anticipating them, which she took as a good sign. Nathaniel watched her do this without interfering. Once, early on, he suggested she might want to focus on just one area rather than trying to understand everything at once. "I understand everything at once," she said. "That's how I work." He nodded and didn't suggest otherwise again. What she found in those first weeks was an operation that was genuinely impressive and also genuinely imperfect in ways that had accumulated because one man, no matter how capable, could not see in all directions simultaneously. The livestock records were meticulous. The supply chain records were not. They lived primarily in Cable's head, which was reliable but not transferable. The seed production was profitable but undersold because no one had time to develop the trading relationships more systematically. The timber contract had 2 clauses that were quietly unfavorable and had apparently never been renegotiated because negotiating required correspondence, and correspondence required time that Nathaniel didn't have. She rewrote the correspondence herself. She didn't ask. She drafted it, brought it to Nathaniel, explained what she'd done and why, and waited. He read it twice. Then he said, "This is better than anything I would have written." "I know," she said. "Do you want to send it?" "Yes," he said. She sent it. This became the pattern of those weeks. She found things. She fixed what she could fix without authorization. She brought Nathaniel what required his approval. She was not always right. Twice she proposed changes to the supply schedule that Cable gently corrected, pointing out variables she hadn't accounted for. And both times she went back and reworked the plan and came back with something better than the first version. Cable, she discovered, was not a man who enjoyed being wrong, but he was a man who could recognize right when he saw it, which made him someone she could work with. The workers watched her the way workers always watched a new person with authority they weren't sure of yet. Some of them were careful with her. Some of them were friendly in the way that was mostly curiosity. A few of the older hands were reserved in the manner of people who had learned that things that looked like change were usually followed by something they didn't like. She didn't try to win them over. She just did the work, consistently, and let that speak at the pace it would speak. There was one man, a hand named Greer, who managed the Eastern grazing rotation, who was openly skeptical. Not hostile exactly, but the kind of skeptical that involved pointed questions in front of others, designed less to get information than to test whether she'd stumble. He did it twice in the first week. Both times Eliza answered the question directly and accurately without rising to the subtext. The third time, she turned the question back on him. "What would you do differently?" she asked, in a tone that made clear she was actually asking rather than deflecting. He hadn't expected that. He answered, and his answer was partially good, and she told him which part was good and why and what the limitation was, and after that he stopped asking pointed questions and started asking actual ones. All of this was the daily texture of those weeks, productive, exhausting, interesting in the way that hard problems are interesting when you have the capacity to engage with them. Eliza fell into bed each night later than was reasonable and woke before sunrise and kept going, because that was what the situation required and because, underneath the exhaustion, something in her was lit up in a way it hadn't been in years. She wrote letters to her father twice a week. He wrote back when he was able, his handwriting shakier than it had been, but the voice in the letters still fully him, dry, observant, occasionally funny in the way he'd always been funny, which was the kind of humor that didn't announce itself. He told her the doctor Nathaniel had arranged was competent. He told her the roof had been fixed. He told her in one letter that several people in town had come around asking where she was, and that he had told them she was well, which was all they needed to know. She read that letter twice and pressed it flat between two books and kept it. Nathaniel and Eliza ate dinner together most nights. In the beginning, these meals were largely about the operation, problem-solving over food, which suited them both. Over time, they became something slightly different. The work was still often the vehicle, but the conversation began to range further, into his years building the valley, into her years managing the ranch in Garvey's Crossing, into the mechanics of how they each thought about problems and what that thinking had cost them in the ways it had. He told her about the early years in the valley, when it was him and Cable and two other men in a rough camp with more ambition than infrastructure. The winters had been brutal. One year a supply line failed and they'd lived on dried venison and boiled grain for 6 weeks. He told it without drama, the way you told a story about something that had tested you enough that you were done needing it to sound impressive. She told him about the winter 3 years ago when her father's illness first became serious, and she'd managed the ranch alone for 4 months while also nursing him, and the feed supplier had tried to short her on a delivery because he'd assumed she wouldn't check the count. "Did you report him?" Nathaniel asked. "I didn't need to," she said. "I checked the count in front of him, noted the discrepancy in the ledger in front of him, and told him the shortfall would be deducted from the next invoice. Then I looked at him until he agreed." Nathaniel looked at her with what she was beginning to recognize as his version of amusement. It wasn't a big expression. It was a slight shift around the eyes and the corner of his mouth, easily missed if you weren't paying attention. "What?" she said. "I'm picturing it," he said. "It wasn't dramatic," she said. "It was just arithmetic." "Most effective things are," he said. There was a night, about 3 weeks in, when he said something that she kept returning to afterward. They were sitting at the table after dinner, maps between them, working out the best route for the representative from Hale's office. Arthur Hale's man, whose name they'd received by letter as a Mr. Colburn, was due in approximately 6 weeks. "He's going to look at you," Nathaniel said, studying the map. "Everyone looks at me," Eliza said. "Not the way Colburn will. Hale sent him specifically to evaluate the operation's stability. He'll look at the household arrangement as part of that assessment." He glanced up at her. "He'll be looking for reasons to doubt." She understood what he was circling. "You mean he'll look at me and wonder if you made a poor decision?" "Yes," he said. "Damien will have already written to Hale suggesting as much." She was quiet for a moment. "And what do you think he'll find?" Nathaniel looked at her directly. "I think he'll find someone who has reorganized the supply chain records in 3 weeks and renegotiated a timber contract and learned the Eastern grazing rotation well enough to correct it." He paused. "I think if he's a perceptive man, that's what he'll find." "And if he's not a perceptive man?" "Then he'll see what Damien told him to see," Nathaniel said, "and we'll have to deal with that differently." She nodded. We'll deal with it either way, she said. It wasn't bravado. It was the same arithmetic she'd been doing her whole life. He looked at her for a moment. I owe you an apology, he said. She waited. For not telling you the full scope of things before we left Garvey's Crossing. He said it plainly, without the qualifications that apologies sometimes came wrapped in. I made a calculation about what you needed to know and when, and I was wrong to make it unilaterally. You asked for that. You deserved it. She considered him. Why now? Because I've had enough weeks to watch how you work, he said, and I understand now that I didn't need to manage the information to manage the outcome. You're capable of handling the full picture. I should have trusted that from the start. It was, she thought, a more complete apology than she had expected. Not just the acknowledgement, but the reasoning, the actual admission of where the calculation had failed. Men who apologized like that were either genuinely thoughtful or very skilled at appearing so, and she had been watching him long enough that she was fairly confident which this was. All right, she said. All right, he said. Apology accepted. Now tell me about Colburn. What do we know about him? He almost smiled. I'll get the letter, he said. 3 days before the 5th week ended, Damian Blackwood came to the valley. He did not announce himself. He arrived in the afternoon, coming up the eastern trail that Eliza hadn't known existed until she'd found it on the older maps, and he came with 2 other men, associates of some kind, she didn't know them, in a manner that suggested he had every right to be there. Cable was the first to see them. He came to find Eliza in the seed storage building, where she was doing inventory with one of the younger workers, a quiet girl named Patsy, who had a talent for numbers she'd apparently never had anyone point out to her. Damian's here, Cable said from the doorway. Eliza straightened. Where's Nathaniel? Northfield. I've sent someone. How long to get back? 30 minutes, maybe 25. She looked at Patsy. Finish the south section and start the east. Write down anything that doesn't match. She handed Patsy her second pencil and walked out of the building. She saw Damian before he saw her. He was at the center of the main yard, having dismounted, looking around with the proprietary air of a man doing an appraisal. His 2 associates had stayed on their horses. Damian himself was dressed better than he'd been in Garvey's Crossing, a deliberate choice on a day he'd presumably planned. Then he turned and saw her, and his expression ran through several things quickly before settling on something that was trying to be pleasant. Mrs. Blackwood, he said. It was the first time anyone had called her that. She absorbed it without showing the small jolt it gave her. Mr. Blackwood, she said. She kept walking toward him at the same pace she'd been walking, not hurrying, not slowing. She stopped at a distance that was conversational rather than confrontational. I don't see that we were expecting you. I try to keep my visits casual, he said, less ceremony. He looked around the yard. Nathaniel about? He'll be along shortly, she said. Damian looked at her the way he'd looked at her in her kitchen in Garvey's Crossing. That slow inventory. The difference was that this time she was standing in her own yard, which was not her kitchen in Garvey's Crossing, and everything about the surroundings contradicted the image he'd apparently constructed of what her life here was. Settling in, he said, with the tone of a man asking the question beneath the question, which was, is this real or is it performance? Yes, she said simply. Quite a place, he said, looking around again. Always has been. Nathaniel's done well. There was something in the way he said it, a studied neutrality that was doing a lot of work. He has, she said. Took a lot of years, though, Damian said. Working alone. No one to share things with. He looked back at her. Must have been lonely. She understood what he was doing. I was looking for the seam, the place where the arrangement showed its artificiality, where she hadn't been here long enough to know the things she should know or do the things she should do. He was probing. I imagine it was, she said, but he had cable and a good crew and the work. She paused. Some people are suited to that kind of focus. It tends to produce good results in the end. She gestured toward the barns. As you can see. Damian smiled. Indeed. He looked at her with the smile still on. I heard you came from quite difficult circumstances. Your father, Harold, is that right? Sick for some time. That's right. Terrible thing. He said it like he was reciting. Nathaniel always had a generous impulse, taking on another family's troubles. The smile didn't move. He's got a good heart. Every word was precisely calibrated. She heard all of it. Nathaniel made a practical decision based on mutual benefit, she said, as he tends to do. She held his gaze. He's not sentimental, as I'm sure you know. He doesn't take on troubles. He evaluates situations and makes assessments. She paused. As do I. Something flickered behind Damien's eyes. She caught it and filed it. The sound of hooves from the Northfield Trail came before Nathaniel appeared. He was moving faster than 30 minutes, which meant Cable's messenger had been quick, or Nathaniel had been closer than estimated. He came into the yard at a pace that was not quite hurrying, and took in the scene in one sweep before his expression settled. Damien, he said. He dismounted and came forward, and they did not embrace. They shook hands in the manner of men who knew each other's accounting better than they knew each other. Didn't know you were coming. Passing through, Damien said. Wanted to see how things were. He glanced between Nathaniel and Eliza. Your wife has been good company. She usually is, Nathaniel said. He came to stand near Eliza. Close. Not close enough to be theatrical about it, but a change in proximity that was quietly deliberate. Damien looked at the two of them. She felt him evaluating the arrangement, looking for the visible gap between them that would tell him what he needed to know. She didn't look at Nathaniel to see what he was doing. She trusted that he would read the situation the same way she was reading it. Come in, Nathaniel said. We'll eat. I can't stay long, Damien said, which was almost certainly not true. Nevertheless, Nathaniel said. They went inside. Eliza went ahead to find May, the woman who cooked and managed the house, to let her know they'd have guests. May was a broad, gray-haired woman who had opinions about everything and expressed them primarily through the quality or lack of quality she brought to a meal when she was displeased. Eliza had learned this in the third week. She relayed the information to May in a way that communicated, "We need this to be good, and also, I will explain later." May gave her a look that said, "I already know," and went back to what she was doing with the particular efficiency of someone who was going to perform exceptionally and be annoyed about it. At dinner, Damien worked through the meal with the practiced ease of a man who was skilled at conversation as extraction. He asked about the operation, questions that sounded like friendly interest and were actually inventory. How many head were they running on the north pasture now? Whether the timber contract had renewed, what they were planning with the eastern acreage. Nathaniel answered most of it, briefly, accurately, without giving more than what was asked. Eliza ate and listened and spoke only when something was directed at her, which Damien began doing more as the meal went on, clearly trying to find a vein of inexperience or uncertainty he could work. He asked her about the supply arrangements. She answered correctly. He asked about the seed production yield from the previous season. She answered correctly, citing the figure she'd memorized from the records in the third week. He asked, with a smile, whether she'd had much experience with an operation of this scale before. No, she said, but I found the principles transfer. The arithmetic is the same whether the numbers are large or small. The main difference is that the consequences of an error are proportionally larger. She looked at him evenly, which is why I prefer to read contracts carefully before signing anything. The silence at the table lasted about 2 seconds. Damien's smile held. Very sensible, he said. Nathaniel reached for the water pitcher and refilled his glass and said nothing. After dinner, Damien and Nathaniel talked on the porch while Eliza cleared the table, not because it was her job, but because being inside while they were outside meant she couldn't hear the conversation, and she needed to be able to hear the conversation. She worked slowly, carrying plates to the kitchen and returning, and each time she passed the open door, she caught pieces. Damien was asking about the Hale investment. Nathaniel was confirming that Colburn's visit was scheduled. Damien was saying something about wanting to be present for the assessment, to vouch for the operation, he said, since he knew Hale's people and might be useful as a character reference. She heard Nathaniel say, "That won't be necessary." She heard Damien say, "I insist, it's a family matter, Nathaniel. I want to see you succeed." She carried the last of the plates to the kitchen and stood there for a moment with her hands braced on the counter. She knew what Damien was doing. If he was present when Colburn arrived, he could do in person what he'd been doing in letters. Shade the assessment, introduce doubts, be the charming uncle who regretfully raised concerns out of family loyalty. Nathaniel could say he wasn't needed. Damien could simply be here anyway, and Nathaniel couldn't physically remove him. and the optics of a family conflict would themselves be damaging. She went back out to the table, picked up the water pitcher, and carried it to the porch under the pretext of refilling it, because what she actually needed was for Damien to see her face. Both men looked at her as she came out. "I couldn't help but hear," she said to Damien pleasantly, "about the Hale visit." She refilled Nathaniel's glass, then Damien's. "It's thoughtful of you to want to be here, though I suspect Mr. Colburn will want to see the operation primarily. He strikes me as the kind of man who forms his own impressions rather than relying on testimony." She set the pitcher down. "We'll likely be giving him a lot of time with the records and the staff directly." She paused. "The records are quite thorough. I've been working with Cable to make sure everything is organized for the assessment." She smiled. "I do find that people who know what they're looking at rarely need anyone to explain it to them." There was a particular quality to the silence that followed. Damien looked at her with the smile that was becoming thinner every time she saw it. "How efficient of you," he said. "We try to be," she said. She picked up the pitcher. "I'll let you two finish. Early morning tomorrow." She looked at Damien. "Will you be staying the night? May can make up a room." "No," he said. His voice was smooth. "I'll ride back. Long day." "Safe travels then," she said, and went inside. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of them finishing their conversation on the porch, and Damien's horses leaving the yard 20 minutes later. Then she heard the door and Nathaniel's footsteps, and he came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway. She was still standing at the counter. She had been working through the geometry of what had just happened, what Damien knew, what he suspected, what he was going to do next, what the next 6 weeks before Colburn arrived needed to look like. "He's going to write to Hale tonight," she said, without turning around. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He's going to say the marriage is recent, the household is uncertain, and that a rushed arrangement raises questions about judgment." She turned to face him. "That's the most honest version of what he'll say. The actual letter will be more delicate." "Yes," Nathaniel said again. "So we have 6 weeks," she said, "not to make this look like something it isn't. That would be obvious and it would fail, but to make sure that Colburn sees something real." She paused. "Which means the work I've been doing, the records, the supply chain, the correspondence, all of it has to be demonstrably functional by the time he arrives. And it has to be clear that it's been functional for long enough that it couldn't be staged." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with that complicated expression she was getting better at reading. "You're already 10 steps ahead of where I am," he said. "I'm not," she said. "I'm 1 step ahead. There's a difference." He came further into the kitchen and sat down at the small table in the corner that she'd started using as a secondary workspace because the main table was often covered in maps. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy all day and was considering the possibility of setting it down. "Damien's never done anything like this before," he said. "Not directly. He's always stayed on his side of the line. Because before, the line was about a modest operation that wasn't worth the exposure," Eliza said. "Hale's investment changes the scale. It changes what's worth the risk." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. I think he's underestimated how this has changed things. When he walked in today, he showed its seams. A marriage of convenience with no real foundation." She paused. "He found something else." "What do you think he found?" Nathaniel asked. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know exactly," she said, "but I know he was recalculating before he left. He was doing the same thing I do, taking in information and adjusting the model." She looked at Nathaniel. "He's going to come back harder. He's going to look for something specific to use." "And if he finds it?" "Then we deal with it when we find it," she said. "The same way we've dealt with everything else." She paused. "But I'd rather find it first." Nathaniel was quiet. The lamp on the table threw a warm circle of light between them, and outside the kitchen window the valley was completely dark, the mountains invisible, just the sound of the creek somewhere below and the occasional sound from the barns. "There's something you don't know," he said. She waited. "Damien has a document." He said it carefully, the way someone says something they've been deciding whether to say. "A promissory note from my brother, from Thomas. Before Thomas died, he borrowed money from Damien. I don't know the full circumstances, Thomas never told me. And the note is for an amount that, with accrued interest, comes to nearly 1/3 of what this operation is worth." He looked at the table. "I've known about it for 2 years. I've been trying to establish whether it's legitimate or whether Damien has altered the terms. I haven't been able to get access to the original." Eliza held very still. He could use that to claim a creditor's interest in the estate. Yes. If he presented it during Colburn's visit, with the right framing, family debt, unsettled estate, disputed succession, it would raise enough questions to delay the investment, Nathaniel said, which might be all he needs. He looked at her. "I should have told you sooner." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He nodded. "Where is the original document?" she asked. "His office in Garvey's Crossing, in the filing cabinet, the one in the back of the lending office. Thomas mentioned it once before he died. He said Damien kept his important documents in the locked cabinet behind his desk." Eliza looked at the lamp for a moment. She was running through implications with the steady mechanical speed that came when the problem was serious and the timeline was compressed. "I know that office," she said. "I signed papers there. I know the layout." She paused. "Does Damien know that I know where the document is?" "No," Nathaniel said. "He doesn't know Thomas told me, and he wouldn't connect you to that information." "Then we have one advantage," she said. "He doesn't know what I know." She looked at Nathaniel. "I need to think about this. Don't do anything about the document yet. Let me think." He looked at her steadily. "Eliza, whatever you're thinking, I'm thinking carefully," she said. "That's all. Just let me think." He nodded. She sat at the small table long after Nathaniel had gone to bed, in the quiet of the kitchen with the lamp burning low, and she thought about promissory notes and locked filing cabinets and men who built their schemes on the assumption that the people they underestimated wouldn't understand what was at stake until it was too late. She thought about the look on Damien's face when he'd walked into that yard today and found her there. Not crumpled, not uncertain, not the desperate woman from Garvey's Crossing he'd calculated on. She thought about the recalculation she'd seen in his eyes. He was going to move faster now. She was sure of it. He'd come to assess, and he'd found something that changed his timeline. He would apply more pressure before the 6 weeks were up. He would look for the weakness she hadn't shown him yet. She picked up her pencil and began to write. Not the official records, not the supply chain notes, just her own thinking, laid out in the cramped handwriting she'd developed as a girl, when paper was expensive and she'd learned to fit more onto less. Outside, the mountains stood around the valley in the dark, indifferent and permanent, the same as they'd always been, the same as they'd be when everything playing out in the valley below was long resolved one way or another. Inside the kitchen, Eliza Monroe, Eliza Blackwood, she reminded herself, though the name still arrived with a small jolt, kept writing until the lamp oil ran low and the light began to dim, and by then she had the beginning of something that felt less like a plan and more like a reckoning. She did not tell Nathaniel the full plan, not because she didn't trust him, but because she had learned over the course of their weeks together that Nathaniel's particular brand of integrity had a cost. He would not allow her to take a risk he considered disproportionate, and he would argue the point with a thoroughness that would eat time they didn't have. So she told him the part he needed to know and held the rest in her own hands, which was something she was practiced at. What she told him, she needed to go to Garvey's Crossing. Her father needed to see her, which was true. Harold's last letter had been shorter than usual, and the handwriting had deteriorated in a way that worried her. She would be gone 4 days. She would take the bay gelding, who was faster than the roan. She would be careful on the mountain trail. What she did not tell him, she intended to go into Damien Blackwood's lending office and read that promissory note. Nathaniel agreed to the trip with the careful face of a man who suspected he was not getting the complete picture, but who also recognized that pressing the point would not improve things. He made her take Cable's trail map of the eastern route, which cut a half day off the crossing. He did not ask her to be quick, which she appreciated because she would have lied about the timeline. She left at first light on a Thursday. The mountain crossing alone gave her 2.5 days to think, which was both a luxury and a problem, because thinking for 2.5 days about the same set of variables tends to produce either clarity or obsession, and she was never entirely sure which she was landing on until she was through to the other side. What she turned over, again and again, was the promissory note. What she knew, it existed. Damien had it. Thomas had signed it before he died. What she didn't know, whether the terms had been altered, as Nathaniel suspected, whether the amount was legitimate, whether it had ever been properly witnessed, whether Damien had kept the original or whether what was in that cabinet was a copy, a version he'd had the patience to construct carefully over 2 years. She also thought about the risk of what she was planning. She was not naive about it. Walking into Damien Blackwood's office to read a document he didn't know she knew about was not a small thing. If she was wrong about what she'd find, if she found nothing or found something she couldn't use, she would have shown her hand and given him information about what she was looking for. And if she was caught doing it, the damage to everything they were building would be catastrophic. But if she was right, and if she found what she suspected she'd find, she would have something Damien had never expected anyone to have. And men like Damien, who built their schemes on the assumption that the other side didn't know the full extent of the scheme, were particularly vulnerable to the moment when that assumption proved wrong. She came down the eastern slope on the afternoon of the second day, and Garvey's Crossing appeared below her, looking exactly as it always had. Small, permanent in its smallness. The kind of place that changed slowly enough that absence didn't register in the landscape. She went to her father's house first, because that was what she'd told Nathaniel she was doing, and because it was also what she actually needed to do. Harold Monroe was in his chair by the window, which was where he spent most of his time now. He looked thinner than when she'd left, and the quality of his attention was different. Still fully Harold, still dry and precise, but tired in a deeper way than before. The coughing had worsened. The doctor's medicines helped with the sharpness of it, but not the frequency. He looked at her when she came through the door and said, "You look different." She put her bag down. "How so?" "Less waiting," he said. "You look like someone who's in the middle of something instead of waiting for it to start." She pulled a chair close to his and sat down. "I'm in the middle of something," she said. She told him most of it. She left out the plan about the office, not because Harold would have judged her for it, but because he would have worried, and she did not want him worrying. She told him about the valley, about cable, about the documents she'd reorganized, about Colburn coming in 3 weeks. She told him about Damien's visit and what she'd read in his face. Harold listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "This man," he said, "Nathaniel. What's he like?" She thought about it. "Honest," she said. "Not in a simple way. In a complicated way that costs him something." Harold looked at her. "And you? What are you like with him?" She held his gaze. "Careful," she said. "Still careful." He nodded. "That's fair," he said. "It's early." He paused. "But you don't sound unhappy." "I'm not unhappy," she said. "I'm occupied. There's a difference." "For you," he said, with the slight dryness that was his version of humor, "that's about the same thing." She stayed with him through the evening and made dinner, the same bean soup she'd always made, and they sat together in the kitchen while the light went, and she told him smaller things. About May and her opinions about meal quality, about Greer and his pointed questions, about Patsy, who was quietly remarkable with figures. Harold laughed at the May story, a real laugh that turned into coughing, and then resolved. And she pretended she hadn't watched his face during it. In the morning, she told him she had an errand in town. "What kind of errand?" he said. "The kind that requires me to be unremarkable," she said. "So I'm not going to tell you more than that." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were still sharp, whatever else the illness had taken. "Be careful," he said. "Always," she said. Damien Blackwood's lending office sat on the east end of Main Street between a saddler's shop and a building that had been 3 different businesses in the time she'd lived there. The lending office had been there longest. Damien had established it 15 years ago, after an earlier career she'd never fully understood, and it had the quality of a thing that had been planted rather than built, settled into the landscape on purpose. She walked past it once, on the opposite side of the street, without looking directly at it. She counted the windows, noted the times, considered the street traffic, which was lighter on this end of Main than it was toward the center. It was mid-morning. Damien was almost certainly at the office. He kept predictable hours, which was itself information about a man who didn't believe anyone had reason to track his schedule. She went to the post office first and collected 2 letters that had come for her father. She went to the dry goods store and bought flour and a packet of dried herbs, which gave her legitimate reason to be on this end of Main Street. She did both things slowly, at the pace of a woman running ordinary errands, and she watched the lending office from angles that didn't look like watching. At 20 minutes past 11, Damien came out of the office and walked north toward the hotel where he took his midday meal. He went at 11:20 every day that she could remember, and it was now 11:23. He had one of his associates with him. Not the type to leave someone behind to mind the office, because the office had a lock and Damien trusted locks over people. She waited 4 minutes. Then she crossed the street. The office door was locked. She had expected this. She had also spent part of the mountain crossing thinking about the window she had seen 2 years ago, when Harold had signed his original loan documents, and she had been in that office, and she had looked, as she always looked, at the physical details of a space. The window on the east side of the building, the one that caught the morning light, had a latch mechanism that was slightly warped. She had noticed it the way she noticed things, without deciding to, because noticing was just how she functioned. She went around the side of the building, where the gap between the lending office and the saddler's shop created a narrow alley that was unobserved from the street. She looked at the window. The warped latch was still there. She could see the slight gap where the frame didn't seat fully. She had never in her life opened a window without permission. She thought about this for exactly 1 second, and then she pushed the frame at the point where the latch was weakest, and the window swung inward with a sound that was minimal and a feeling of crossing a line that was irreversible. She went through the window with less grace than she would have preferred, and landed on the floor of the office with her heart going considerably faster than usual. She straightened and stood still and listened. Nothing. The street noise from outside muffled, the building settling slightly in the late morning heat. The office was organized in the precise, airless way of a man who used organization as a form of control. The front desk was clear. The shelves held ledgers in chronological order. Behind the desk, against the back wall, was the filing cabinet. Dark wood, 4 drawers with a lock on each. She crossed to it and looked at the locks and understood that her plan, which had felt reasonable on a mountainside, had arrived at its most significant problem. She stood there for a moment and thought. Damien trusted locks, which meant he invested in them. The locks on this cabinet were not decorative. Breaking them would leave evidence. She needed access without evidence. She opened the center desk drawer instead. Keys were always somewhere practical for people who access their own locks frequently, not hidden somewhere theatrical, just kept in a place convenient enough to be used daily without thought. The center drawer had pens, a letter opener, a small amount of coin, a pocket watch that needed winding, and a key ring with 4 keys. She took the key ring to the cabinet and tried each key on the top drawer. The third key turned. The top drawer held correspondence. She found Hale's name within 2 minutes. There were 3 letters Damien had sent and copies he'd kept of Hale's responses, which told her immediately that this was a man who documented everything, which was both useful and potentially dangerous. She read each letter carefully, moving through them at the speed she always moved through documents, retaining what mattered. The letters were exactly what she'd predicted: careful, regretful, the tone of a concerned family member raising questions out of loyalty rather than interest. He told Hale that Nathaniel was impulsive, that the marriage had been sudden and suggested poor judgment, that there were unresolved family financial questions that any serious investor should want clarified before committing. She put the letters back precisely as she'd found them. The second drawer down required the 4th key. She found it on the 3rd try. Inside were property documents, contracts, and at the back of the drawer, held together with a length of cord, a set of papers that were older than the rest. The paper slightly yellowed, the ink faded at the edges in the way of something that had been stored for several years. She untied the cord and opened the first page and read. It took her 6 minutes to read all of it. She read it twice. The second read was slower, because on the second read she was looking at something specific, a specific line in the witness section at the bottom of the final page. The promissory note bore Thomas Blackwood's signature. The amount was significant, not as large as Nathaniel had feared, but large enough. The interest clause was steep, but it was the witness signature that she stayed with, reading the name twice, 3 times. Edmund Foss. She stood in the dim office and thought about that name. Foss. Elbert Foss, the traveling magistrate who had married her and Nathaniel 6 weeks ago. Elbert Foss with his ink-stained fingers and his quarterly circuit and his register of 200 marriages. Edmund Foss. A relative? A coincidence? Or the same man, signing as a private witness rather than in his official capacity? She needed to know. And she could not ask Nathaniel without explaining how she'd come to read the document, which meant she would have to tell him everything, which she had been prepared to do from the beginning. The concealment was never about hiding things from Nathaniel permanently. It was about not arguing the plan before she'd executed it. She retied the cord exactly as she'd found it. She closed the drawer, locked it. She replaced the keyring in the center desk drawer. She went back to the window, climbed through with the same lack of grace, and pulled it shut from outside until she felt the warped latch catch. She walked back to the street and turned north and kept her pace even and her face at the expression of a woman who had just finished her errands, which was what she was. She was back at her father's house by noon. Harold looked at her when she came in and did not ask. She sat down across from him and said, "I need to know about a man named Edmund Foss. He may be related to Elbert Foss, the traveling magistrate. He signed a document approximately 4 years ago in Garvey's Crossing." Harold was quiet for a moment. "Edmund Foss," he said. Then, "There was an Edmund Foss here, not a permanent resident. He came through maybe 4 or 5 years back, stayed about a year, worked for Damien, I think, some kind of clerk or account manager." Harold looked at the window. "I remember because there was some talk about him, something to do with documents. Someone said he'd signed papers he shouldn't have. He left town not long after." Harold looked back at her. "Is Elbert Foss?" "His brother," she said, guessing based on the pattern, because that was what the evidence suggested. "Or close enough." Harold watched her. "How bad is it?" "The signature may not be legitimate," she said. Edmund Foss wasn't a licensed witness in any official capacity. If the document required a licensed witness, which a promissory note of that size likely did under territorial law, then the document may not be legally enforceable. She paused. "But proving that requires finding Edmund Foss, or finding evidence of his status at the time, or finding someone who knew what he actually was. Or," Harold said slowly, "finding the magistrate who is his brother and asking him directly." Eliza looked at her father. He was smiling, not broadly, just the quiet private version that meant he was following the line of something and found it satisfying. "Elbert Foss comes through on his quarterly circuit," she said. "He was in the valley 6 weeks ago. He'll be in the territory again." "In about 6 weeks," Harold said. "He always comes through Garvey's Crossing on the second leg. I've seen his circuit schedule. He stops at the post office." 6 weeks. Approximately the same timeline as Colburn's visit. She sat back and looked at the ceiling of her father's kitchen and thought about the geometry of it. The promissory note with the questionable witness, the traveling magistrate with his precise habits and his quarterly circuit, the investor's representative arriving from Philadelphia, and Damian Blackwood, who had built his whole play on the assumption that nobody on the other side of the table knew what he knew. "I need paper," she said. Harold pointed to the shelf. She wrote for an hour. She wrote to a territorial land office in the nearest city, requesting the licensing records for notarial witnesses in Garvey's Crossing for the period 4 years prior. She wrote it as a general records inquiry, the kind that any citizen could make, framed as research into property documentation for the Monroe estate. She sealed it and addressed it. Then she wrote a second letter. This one she addressed to Elbert Foss, in care of the Territorial Circuit Court office that managed his appointments, because all traveling magistrates logged their circuits with the court. She worded it carefully, not accusatory, not explanatory, just a request for information about a document she'd encountered bearing a name similar to his, and whether he might be willing to speak with her when his circuit brought him through the territory. She sealed that one too and put them in her bag to post on the way out of town. "You're not just trying to stop him," Harold said, watching her. "No," she said. "You're trying to make it so he can't try again," Harold said. "After." She looked at her father. "A document that's questionable can be used once if the pressure is right and the timing is right. But a document that's been examined and found deficient, that's not a weapon anymore. It's a liability." She paused. "If he tries to use it in front of Colburn and we're ready, it doesn't just fail, it tells Colburn exactly what kind of man Damien is." Harold was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your mother would have had something to say about all of this." "What would she have said?" "She would have said, 'Be careful of the thing you're becoming when you do this,'" Harold said. Not as a warning exactly, more as something he was thinking out loud. Not because it's wrong, because the line between strategy and something harder to undo is thin. Eliza sat with that. I know, she said. I'm watching it. I know you are, he said. That's why I'm not telling you to stop. She left the next morning. Harold stood in the doorway the way he'd stood when she'd left the first time, and this time she did look back once and held the image of him there. Smaller than he used to be, but still fully himself, still reading her accurately across any distance. And then she turned forward and kept riding. She was back in the valley by the evening of the fourth day. Nathaniel was in the main room when she came in, at the table with Cowboy, both of them over a set of drawings she didn't recognize. They both looked up. Good trip? Cable said, with his particular economy. Productive, she said. Nathaniel said nothing immediately. He looked at her the way he looked at things he was reading, carefully, without announcing it. After Cable left, Nathaniel said, You did something. Yes, she said. She sat down across from him and told him all of it. The window, the keys, the promissory note, Edmund Foss and what she suspected, the letters she'd sent. She told it clearly, in order, without embellishment, the way she presented any set of facts. When she finished, Nathaniel was very still. You went through his office, he said. Yes, she said. If he finds out, he won't, she said. I left nothing disturbed. But more importantly, even if he suspects, he can't prove it without admitting the document's existence and its location, which opens the question of why he's kept it locked up for 4 years rather than pursuing the debt. She held Nathaniel's gaze. He can't use the suspicion without the proof. Same as us. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. She let him be quiet. Edmund Foss, he said finally. I didn't know about a connection to Elbert. Neither did I until I found the signature, she said. It may not be the same family. It may be coincidence. But the licensing question stands regardless of who Edmund Foss is. If he wasn't licensed to witness a document of that size, the note is deficient on its face. Damien would know this, which means he either didn't know Edmund's status or he knew and counted on no one checking, Nathaniel said. Yes, she said. Nathaniel stood up and walked to the window and stood there looking out at the dark yard. She watched his back. He was doing the same thing she did, running through implications, adjusting the model, finding the new shape of the problem. If Elbert Foss confirms a family connection, he said, and if the licensing records show Edmund had no standing, we have something to take to a territorial judge. Not just a defense against Damien's claim, but a potential fraud case. Yes, she said. That's a significant escalation. It is, she said. Damien escalated first. He's had that note in his cabinet for 4 years, and he's been waiting for the right moment. This is the right moment, from his perspective. She paused. I'd rather be ready. He turned from the window. The lamp was behind him, and his face was partly in shadow, but she could see enough of his expression to read it. Not angry, not frightened, something more complex than either. The look of a man revising his understanding of his situation and of the person across the room from him. I told you in Garvey's Crossing, he said, that I needed someone with specific qualities. You did, she said. I didn't fully understand what I was asking for, he said. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she said, I need to know if you're all right with the risk I took. Not just the legal dimension, whether you think I crossed a line. He was quiet for a moment. I think, he said slowly, that you made a decision I would have been too cautious to make, and that it was probably the right decision, and that I'm still working through the part where you went to Garvey's Crossing and did this without fully telling me. He paused. All of that is true at the same time. Yes, she said. I know. I don't want you to do that again, he said. Not because I don't trust your judgment, because I want to be... He stopped, started again. I'd rather know. Even if I argue, I'd rather know. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. That's fair. He nodded. She pulled the stack of drawings toward her that he and Cable had been working on. What is this? She asked. Plans for the Eastern expansion, he said, coming back to the table. If the Hale investment comes through, we'll need to start on the infrastructure before winter. She looked at the drawings. They were rough but detailed, the kind of plans made by someone who understood the practical constraints of building in mountain terrain. She turned the top sheet to orient herself and began reading it the way she read everything, from the overall shape down to the details, noting where the logic held and where it had gaps. "This water line," she said, pointing. "It runs uphill here. You'd need a pump system." "I know," he said. "I haven't solved it yet." She studied it. "What if you ran the line east along the ridge first, then dropped it here? You'd get enough grade to run by gravity most of the way. It would add 300 feet of pipe, but remove the pump cost." He leaned over to look where she was pointing. He was close, closer than usual, and she was aware of it the way she'd become aware of such things gradually over the past weeks. The reality of him as a person in the same physical space, which was a different awareness than she'd started with. "That could work," he said. He was looking at the drawing, but she had the sense he was also aware of the proximity in the same way she was. "Try it with the topographic measurements," she said. "See if the grade works." He straightened. "Yes." He looked at her. "Thank you." "For the water line?" "For Garvey's Crossing," he said. "For all of it." She held his gaze. There was something moving between them that had been building for weeks. The slow accumulation of days spent in the same space working toward the same thing, and she didn't know what to do with it yet. She knew it was real. She knew it was more complicated than anything she'd planned for when she'd said yes on a boarding house doorstep. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Colburn isn't here yet." "No," he said. "But you found the 30-day cure period in week 1, and now this." He paused. I'm beginning to think Damien vastly miscalculated." She thought about Damien's face in the kitchen in Garvey's Crossing. The look, the half-smile, the question asked like a certainty. She thought about everything that look had not accounted for. "He did," she said. "He looked at me and saw exactly what he wanted to see, and he made his plans based on that." She looked back at the drawings. "That's his problem. It always has been." Outside, the valley was dark and quiet, the mountains invisible but present, holding the shape of everything inside them. 3 weeks until Colburn arrived from Philadelphia. 3 weeks until Damien would make his move. Whatever form that move was going to take, whatever he'd decided after his visit, whatever he was putting into motion in the office on the east end of Main Street. Inside the house, Eliza Blackwood spread the expansion plans across the table and kept working, because that was what the situation required, and because for the first time in a very long while, she was not working against something alone. She was working with someone. The difference, she was finding, was larger than she had known how to anticipate. The letter from the Territorial Land Office arrived 11 days before Colburn was due. Eliza was in the seed storage building with Patsy when Cable brought it, holding it out with the particular neutrality of a man who had learned not to editorialize on correspondence he hadn't read. She took it, looked at the return seal, and told Patsy to finish the East Section count and bring the totals to the main house by evening. Then she walked outside and opened the letter standing in the yard. The licensing records for notarial witnesses in Garvey's Crossing for the period in question were 3 pages of names and designations. She found Edmund Foss on the 2nd page. His designation was listed as Provisional Clerical Assistant, temporary appointment, terminated after 8 months. The notation beside his name said, "Not authorized for independent witnessing of financial instruments exceeding $50 territorial dollars." The promissory note Thomas Blackwood had signed was for $4,000. She stood in the yard with the letter in her hands, and the mountains around the valley doing what they always did, which was nothing, which was enough, and she felt the specific satisfaction of a calculation that had resolved correctly. Not triumphant, just settled, the way a number felt when it finally balanced. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket and went to find Nathaniel. He was at the north pasture checking the fence line with Greer, who had, over the past weeks, transformed from a man asking pointed questions designed to trip her up into something closer to a genuine resource, someone who knew the land thoroughly and had begun directing that knowledge toward her rather than testing it against her. She waited at the edge of the field until Nathaniel saw her and came over. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. She watched his face move through the information the way it always moved, controlled, processing, not showing more than necessary. Then he looked up. "It's not enforceable," he said. "Not as written," she said. "A territorial court would need to rule on it formally, but the deficiency is clear on the face of the record. Edmund Foss had no standing to witness that instrument. The note fails without a valid witness. She paused. Which means Damien has known for 4 years that the document he's been sitting on is deficient. He's been holding it anyway, banking on the fact that no one would check the witness's credentials. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He looked back at the letter and then at the mountains and then at her. He was going to use it in front of Colburn, he said. Raise it as a question, introduce uncertainty. He didn't need a court to rule on it. He just needed Colburn to hear the word debt and disputed in the same sentence. Yes, she said, and we needed to be ready for that. She paused. We're ready. He handed the letter back to her. He did not say thank you again. He'd said it in Garvey's Crossing. He'd said it when she came back from Garvey's Crossing. And she'd told him both times that she preferred he save the thanks until the situation was actually resolved. Instead, he said, Has Elbert Foss responded? Not yet, she said, but his circuit brings him through within the same window as Colburn's visit. I think he'll come. You think, Nathaniel said, not skeptical, just noting the gap between what they had and what they needed. I think, she confirmed, which is why we don't rely on it. The licensing record is enough on its own. Elbert Foss would simply be additional confirmation. She looked at the letter in her hand. What we have now is sufficient to neutralize the document if Damien presents it. What we're still working on is what to do after. After, Nathaniel said. After Colburn's visit. After the investment is confirmed. Damien still holds that note. Deficient or not, it's a document with Thomas's signature on it, and a man like Damien will find another way to use it. Or he'll wait and try again when the circumstances are different. She looked at Nathaniel directly. The note needs to be formally invalidated. That requires filing with the territorial court, which requires Nathaniel Blackwood, as the affected party, to make a formal statement about the document and how he came to know of its deficiency. Nathaniel held her gaze. Which requires explaining how you found the licensing records. Which requires explaining that I pursued a records inquiry, she said carefully. The inquiry was public record. Anyone can request it. The fact that I knew what to look for, she paused. The fact that I knew what to look for is what we don't need to explain to a court. He looked at her for a moment. She could see him thinking through the distinction, finding where the line was, deciding whether the line was where she'd placed it. All right, he said. We file after Colburn leaves, she said. Regardless of the outcome of his visit, the invalidation case stands separately. Yes, he said. Greer was watching them from 50 yards away with the tact of a man who knew when to look at fence posts instead of people. Eliza looked at the north pasture, green and wide, the cattle moving slowly through the morning light, the whole operation visible from here in a way that reminded her of the first time she'd come through the pass and looked down at something that should not have existed. She thought about what it had taken to get here, not dramatically, not in the way of a story being told, but plainly. The account book in Garvey's Crossing, the knock on the door, 2.5 days on a mountain trail, weeks of records and correspondence and early mornings, and the slow process of learning a place and its people and its risks. The window with the warped latch, her father's kitchen, the careful letters she'd sent and the one careful letter she was still waiting for. None of it had been smooth. None of it had been what she'd planned when she'd said yes on that boarding house doorstep. She'd planned a practical arrangement, and she'd gotten something considerably more complicated. An operation with enemies and vulnerabilities, and a man who was harder to understand than anyone she'd met, and easier in some specific ways than she'd expected. Come back to the house when you're done here, she said. We should go through Colburn's likely questions and make sure our answers are consistent. Nathaniel nodded. She walked back. She spent the rest of the morning with May, which was something she'd started doing deliberately, because May knew the operation in a different way than the documents showed. She knew the human texture of it, who worked well and who had problems, which of the long-term hands had families in the valley versus men who might leave when the next opportunity came, what the general mood was when things were good versus strained. May communicated all of this obliquely, through commentary on other subjects, and you had to be listening in a particular way to catch it. What May communicated this morning, between opinions about the quality of the flour delivery and a detailed assessment of why the chimney in the east building was going to need attention before winter, was that two of the younger hands had been talking about Damien's visit. They'd been talking about whether the operation was stable, not with alarm, just the ordinary talk of working people who kept an eye on whether the place they worked was going to keep existing in its current form. Eliza heard this and absorbed it and didn't react visibly, because reacting visibly to May's oblique communications was not, she had learned, the correct response. What May was telling her was, the workforce notices uncertainty. What the workforce noticed would affect how they performed during Colburn's assessment. After May went back to her domain, Eliza found Cable. "I need to talk to the full crew," she said. "Not all together. I don't want it to look like an announcement, but I need each area to hear something from me in the next week." Cable looked at her. "What do you want them to hear?" "That the operation is sound," she said. "That the expansion is real, not contingent on conditions that might not materialize. That a man coming from Philadelphia to look at the records is normal due diligence, not a threat to their employment." She paused. "None of that is a lie. I just need them to hear it from someone who knows the details, not from each other." Cable was quiet a moment. "You want me to do it, or you?" "Both," she said. "You for the hands who've been here longer, me for the newer ones." She paused. "And you should know, I think we're going to be all right with Colburn. I think the records speak for themselves. But I need the crew to be calm, because a nervous crew reads as an operation with problems, and that's a narrative Damien will use if he gets the chance." Cable looked at her with his permanently squinted eyes. "Nathaniel know you're running this part?" "Nathaniel knows I handle what needs handling," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. "All right," he said. "I'll start with the North crew this afternoon." 7 days before Colburn arrived, Elbert Foss came through the valley. He came on his regular circuit, stopping at the valley the same way he'd stopped 7 weeks ago to perform the wedding, procedurally, efficiently, his quarterly round requiring him to cover the same ground, regardless of what he found there. He arrived in the afternoon and was looking for Nathaniel about a circuit matter when Eliza found him first. She brought him inside and gave him coffee and sat across from him at the main table, and she was direct with him the way she was direct with everyone, because she had found, over the course of her life, that most people responded better to directness than to being managed. She told him she had a question about a man named Edmund Foss, and she watched his face. His face told her immediately that she'd found the right thread. The slight tightening, the careful recalibration before he answered, the way a person looks when a name surfaces that they'd hoped wouldn't. "My brother," Elbert Foss said, quietly. Not defending, not deflecting, just confirming. "He witnessed a promissory note approximately 4 years ago," she said. "A note for $4,000 signed by Thomas Blackwood. I've obtained the licensing records, which show Edmund held a provisional appointment with no authorization to witness financial instruments of that size." She paused. "I'm not here to create problems for you or for your brother. I'm here because that document is being used against this operation and against Nathaniel, and I need to understand what Edmund Foss knew when he signed it." Elbert Foss looked at the table for a moment. He was a small, precise man, but the precision right now was being used for something harder than paperwork. It was being used to hold himself together while he decided something. "Edmund didn't know the full amount," he said finally. "He told me afterward. He said Blackwood, Damien Blackwood, had told him it was a routine signature, a minor formality, that it didn't matter because Edmund was a clerical man and it was just a name on a line." He looked up at Eliza. "Edmund understood afterward what he'd done, what he'd been used to do. He left town because he was afraid of what Blackwood would do if he said anything." "Would Edmund testify to that?" she said. "If he was protected," Foss said. "If it was formal. If there was something—" He stopped. "He's been carrying this 4 years. He's not a bad man. He was young, and he was naive, and Damien Blackwood took advantage of both." "Would you be willing to provide a sworn statement about Edmund's appointment status," she said, "as the licensed magistrate who oversees circuit filings in this territory?" He was quiet. She let him be quiet. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I would." She nodded. She didn't thank him effusively. She could see that what he needed was for this to be treated as a practical matter rather than a moment of high drama. So she treated it that way, and told him she would have Nathaniel draft the formal request, and they went back to the ordinary business of his circuit visit, and he left the next morning looking slightly different than he'd arrived. Lighter, she thought, in the way of someone who'd been carrying something heavy and had found a place to set part of it down. Nathaniel, when she told him, said only, "You were right about him coming." "I was right that it was worth trying," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "Less and less," he said. She didn't have an answer for that, so she let it stand. Colburn arrived on a Wednesday, 10 days after she'd expected him, without explanation for the delay. He rode in from the Eastern Trail, Damien's trail, though he couldn't have known the significance of the route, on a good horse, accompanied by a single assistant who appeared to function primarily as a note-taker. Colburn himself was a lean man in his late 40s, with the traveling clothes of someone who made this kind of assessment trip regularly and had long since optimized for practicality over appearance. He had an accountant's face, observant and difficult to read, and he shook hands with Nathaniel in the yard and with Eliza and with Cable, and looked around the operation with the systematic attention of a man who had done this many times before. He was not what Damien would have hoped for. He was not a man who was going to be charmed or alarmed by rhetoric. He wanted to see the records. She had the records ready. 3 days Colburn spent in the valley, and those 3 days had a texture that was different from everything that had preceded them. Tighter, more watched, each hour carrying more weight than usual. Colburn went through the supply chain documentation, the livestock records, the financial accounts, the land agreements, the expansion plans, the worker arrangements, the trade contracts with the mining camps, and the road project. He asked questions that were specific and competent. He asked them of Nathaniel and of Cable, and on the second afternoon, of Eliza directly, sitting at the main table with his assistant beside him and his notes in front of him. He asked her how long she had been involved in the operations management. She told him the truth, that she had joined as Nathaniel's wife 8 weeks ago, and that the work of organizing the supply documentation and the trade correspondence had begun within her first 2 weeks. He asked her why the supply chain records showed a marked improvement in organization from a specific date. She told him that she had found the records maintained primarily in Cable's memory rather than on paper, and that she had worked with Cable to formalize the documentation in a way that would be legible to outside parties. He asked whether Cable had resisted that process. She said no. She said Cable was practical and had understood that what was useful to one person's memory was not always useful to an operation's long-term continuity. Colburn wrote something down. She had no idea what he was writing, and she resisted the impulse to try to see. He asked her, on the third morning, about a letter he had received from a Damien Blackwood regarding concerns about the operation's stability and leadership. She had expected this question. She had thought carefully about how to answer it, not what to say, because the truth was what she intended to say, but how to say it in a way that was neither defensive nor dismissive, because both would work against them. "I know about Mr. Blackwood's letters," she said. "I know what he's been writing, and I know his reasons for writing it." Colburn looked at her. "His reasons?" "Mr. Blackwood has a competing interest in this operation's eastern expansion land," she said. "He holds a claim on it contingent on a default in the land payment. A default he has been attempting to engineer by undermining Mr. Hale's confidence in the operation's stability." She paused. "He also holds a promissory note bearing Thomas Blackwood's signature. Thomas was Nathaniel's brother, who died 4 years ago, which he intended to present as evidence of an unresolved family debt. The note was witnessed by an individual who had no legal authority to witness financial instruments of its size. We have the licensing records confirming this, and a sworn statement from the territorial magistrate who administered the circuit at the time." She set both documents on the table in front of Colburn. "I wanted you to have those before he had the opportunity to raise the matter himself." The room was very quiet. Colburn looked at the documents. He picked up the licensing record first, read it, set it down. He picked up Elbert Foss's sworn statement, read it, set it down. He looked at Eliza. "You prepared these," he said. "Yes," she said. "How long have you known about the promissory note?" "Since shortly after we returned from Garvey's Crossing," she said. "Nathaniel told me about its existence. I pursued the verification." Colburn looked at her for a moment with the evaluating expression she'd been watching since he arrived. She held it without flinching, not because she was performing composure, but because she was genuinely composed. She had done what could be done. The documents were what they were. His assessment would be what it would be. "Mr. Blackwood," Colburn said, Sent a letter suggesting that the marriage was recent and the household arrangement uncertain. The marriage is recent, she said. 8 weeks. That's accurate. She paused. The household arrangement is a partnership between two people who are working toward the same outcome with their full attention. Whether Mr. Hale considers that certain enough for his purposes is a judgment I can't make for him. She looked at Colburn directly. But I'd suggest that what you've seen in 3 days of records is a better measure of stability than the length of any marriage. Colburn looked at his notes, then at the documents she'd provided, then at her. He did not smile, but something shifted in his expression, a slight adjustment, the face of a man who had recalibrated an estimate. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood," he said. On Colburn's last evening, Damien arrived. She had half expected it. She had told Nathaniel she half expected it, and Nathaniel had positioned Cable near the Eastern Trail entrance for the last 2 days without either of them saying out loud that was what they were doing. When Cable appeared in the doorway of the main house with the single raised eyebrow that communicated what it communicated, Eliza looked at Nathaniel and he looked at her, and they both stood up from the table. Damien came into the yard looking exactly as he had the first time, pressed, deliberate, the manner of a man who had decided the outcome in advance. He pulled up short when he saw Colburn standing in the yard with his assistant. The hesitation lasted barely a second, but Eliza saw it from the porch, and she knew Nathaniel saw it too. "Mr. Colburn," Damien said, recovering, "I wasn't expecting to find you still here." "Mr. Blackwood," Colburn said. The tone was neutral in the way of a man who has already formed his view and does not need additional input. Damien looked at Nathaniel. "I came to see how the assessment was going. As family," he smiled, "to offer any assistance I could." "The assessment is concluded," Colburn said. "I ride out tomorrow morning." Damien's smile held. He looked at Eliza. That slow inventory, the same look from her kitchen in Garvey's Crossing, the same look from his first visit to the valley. But this time she noticed something in it that she hadn't seen before, or perhaps that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty. A hairline fracture in the confidence of a man who had run his calculations on a set of assumptions and was beginning to understand that the assumptions had not held. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "you're looking well." "Thank you," she said. "The mountain air agrees with me." He looked between her and Colburn. "I had hoped to speak with Mr. Colburn about some concerns, family matters, that I thought might be relevant to his assessment." "The concerns you've raised in your correspondence have been addressed," Colburn said. He said it without elaboration, without explanation, with the finality of a door closing. Damien looked at Eliza. She looked back at him with the same face she had maintained across every encounter with him. Not cold, not triumphant, not any of the things he might have expected. Just clear. The face of someone who had done the arithmetic and found it balanced. "I understand," Damien said, "that you've been busy reviewing documentation." "Yes," she said. "Thorough work," he said. The words were neutral. The subtext was not. He was telling her that he knew she'd found something, or suspected it. He was waiting to see whether she would react. She did not react. "We try to be thorough," she said. "You know how it is with records. The more carefully you organize them, the more clearly everything shows." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Nathaniel said, "You've had a long ride, Damien. We won't keep you." It was the first time she'd heard Nathaniel dismiss him directly. It was said calmly, without hostility, but with the unmistakable quality of a door being shown rather than a request being made. Something had shifted in Nathaniel over these weeks. Not dramatically, not in the way of a story wanting its hero to transform cleanly, but in the specific way of a man who had learned that he did not have to manage everything alone, and that knowing this changed what he was willing to say out loud. Damien looked at his nephew for a moment, then at Eliza, then at Colburn. "Of course," he said. His voice was smooth. Whatever he was feeling, and she suspected it was considerable, he had the discipline to keep it out of his face. "Safe travels, Mr. Colburn. Nathaniel." He looked at Eliza one final time. "Mrs. Blackwood." He turned and rode out. The yard was quiet for a moment after he'd gone. Cable, who had materialized at some point without anyone noticing, said, which was his complete commentary, and walked toward the barns. Colburn looked at Nathaniel and at Eliza. "I'll have my report to Mr. Hale within a week of returning," he said. "Based on what I've seen, I expect his decision will follow shortly after. He paused. I've been doing this work for 11 years. I've assessed a great many operations. He looked at them both briefly. This one is well run. He went back inside to finish his notes. Nathaniel stood in the yard and looked at the place where Damien had been and then at Eliza, and something in his face was doing several things at once that she didn't entirely know how to read. She was getting better at reading him, but he was not, and she suspected would never be, a simple face. He'll file the competing land claim anyway, she said, regardless of Colburn's report. I know, Nathaniel said. We file the invalidation case with the territorial court as soon as Colburn is on the road, she said, before Damien has time to move first. I know, he said. She looked at him. Are you all right? He was quiet for a moment. He's my father's brother, he said. I've known him my whole life. He said it plainly, not asking for sympathy, just stating the full texture of what had just happened. He was at my brother's funeral. He sat at this table when Thomas was alive and ate dinner here. He paused. I'm not surprised by anything he's done, but that's different from it not registering. She stood with that. She didn't tell him it would be fine because she didn't know that it would be in every sense he meant. She didn't tell him that family was complicated because he knew that better than anything she could say. She said, I know, because she did know, in the way of someone who had watched a sick father sign a bad loan from a man who'd smiled the whole time. He looked at her. In the fading afternoon light, with the mountains holding the valley on all sides, and the sounds of the operation going about its evening routines, he looked at her the way she'd been getting used to him looking at her, directly, without the management of it, the way he looked at things he was actually seeing rather than assessing. I want to tell you something, he said. She waited. When I came to Garvey's Crossing, he said, I told myself I was making a practical decision, the right person for the right function. I told myself it was about the operation, about what I needed. He paused. That was true. But it wasn't the whole truth of why I asked you specifically. I didn't fully know that at the time. I think I was not being honest with myself about the difference between what I needed for the operation and what I... He stopped, started again. What I wanted to not be alone with. The yard was quiet. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father asking, what's the other reason? She thought about her own answer, which had been about wanting to find out whether Nathaniel was right, whether the qualities people had mocked in her were actually the things that made her powerful. She had found out. The answer had been yes, which was important and real and hers, but it had not been the only thing she'd found. I know, she said. I think I've known for a while. And, he said. And, she said, I am still careful. That's not going to change quickly. I don't think you'd want it to. She paused. But I'm not only careful. He nodded, not rushing it, not asking for more than she'd said, just receiving it the way he received most things, with the full weight of his attention and without demanding a different shape than it had. All right, he said. All right, she said. They stood in the yard for another moment, not touching, not closing the distance into anything more dramatic than two people standing near each other in the early evening. But the quality of it was different from how they'd stood in this same yard 8 weeks ago when she'd arrived and looked at the impossible valley and been furious and calculating and overwhelmed and determined all at the same time. Different, she thought, was not a large enough word, but it was the honest one. The invalidation case was filed the following week. The territorial court processed it within 30 days. As Eliza had calculated it would based on her reading of the court's current docket, which she had obtained through the same public records office she'd used for the licensing inquiry. The court found the promissory note deficient on its face. The witness's lack of authorization was unambiguous, and Elbert Foss's sworn statement provided corroborating context that clarified the circumstances of the signing. The note was declared legally unenforceable. Damien filed the competing land claim on the eastern acreage 3 days after the court date, which was either a tactical blunder or a sign that he'd run out of better options. With the promissory note invalidated and the land office now aware of the competing claim's questionable background, the claim was reviewed under the careful eye of a territorial land officer who had received, through appropriate channels, a copy of the licensing records and the court ruling. The claim was denied within 6 weeks. Hale's confirmation of the investment came by letter before the land claim was even resolved. Colburn's report had been, apparently, unambiguous. The letter was addressed to Nathaniel and Eliza Blackwood jointly, which Colburn had recommended, and which said something about what he'd assessed during his 3 days in the valley that she found satisfying in the quiet arithmetic way she found most satisfying things. She read the letter at the main table with her pencil in her hand and Nathaniel across from her with his coffee, and when she looked up, he was watching her read. "Good news deserves a response," she said. "Write it," he said. She wrote it. Harold Monroe came to the valley in the spring, when the mountain crossing was manageable, and when the doctor and Garvey's crossing, the competent one Nathaniel had arranged, had determined that the journey would not do more harm than good. He came by wagon, with a driver Nathaniel sent, and arrived in the valley looking tired from the trip and fully himself in every way that mattered. He stood at the entrance to the valley the way she had stood, looking down at the scale of it, the impossible green of it in the spring, the operation spread across the valley floor in its working order. "Well," he said, "substantial." She was standing beside him. She almost smiled. "That was his word for it," she said. Harold looked at her sideways. "And what's your word for it?" She looked at the valley, at what she'd learned in it and what she'd built in it and what she was still, daily, figuring out. The system still imperfect, the relationships still being navigated, the problems still arriving in the mornings and requiring answers by evening, the mountains still standing around it all, indifferent and reliable, the way mountains were. "Home," she said. It was the first time she'd said it. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way true things sometimes came out. Not prepared, just arrived, because it had been real for a while and she'd finally caught up to saying it. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." Nathaniel came down the valley path to meet them, and she watched him shake her father's hand and say something she couldn't hear from here, and she watched Harold look at Nathaniel the way Harold looked at things, reading the full picture rather than just the surface. And whatever he found there must have satisfied whatever question he'd been sitting with, because his posture changed in the small way it changed when he was at ease. Months later, nearly a year from the day she'd said yes on a boarding house doorstep in Garvey's Crossing, Eliza stood at the window of the main house in the early morning, before anyone else was up, with her pencil and her notebook, which was still how she started every day. The valley below was in its pre-dawn quiet, the first gray light beginning to separate the mountains from the sky. The expansion was underway, the eastern acreage cleared and fenced, the new buildings framed, the workforce grown by a third. The waterline ran along the ridge the way she'd suggested, gravity doing the work that a pump would have required, which still pleased her in the simple mathematical way it should. She thought about Damien because she made herself think about him sometimes, not with satisfaction, because satisfaction at another person's defeat was something she'd decided to watch carefully in herself, but honestly. He was still in Garvey's Crossing. He was still operating the lending office. He was smaller now, in the particular way a person becomes smaller when the thing they've been building toward collapses. Not humbled, which would have required a different kind of person, but reduced. He had not tried again. She did not expect that to be permanent. She expected him to be patient, the way he had always been patient, and to wait for a different opening. She also expected now to see it coming. She thought about what her father had said, in his kitchen, about the line between strategy and something harder to undo. She had thought about it many times. She thought about Edmund Foss, who had been young and naive and used, and who had carried 4 years of that, and who had, she'd heard through Elbert, recently returned to work for the circuit court in an official capacity. Now, with proper credentials and proper authorization, his provisional appointment converted to something permanent. She thought about whether what she had done in Damien's office had been right or only necessary, and she thought about the fact that those two things were not always the same and that knowing the difference mattered, even when you'd already done the thing. She had not crossed into something she could not come back from. She was fairly sure of that. But she checked it, the way she checked the account books, not assuming, verifying. Behind her, she heard the sound of Nathaniel in the kitchen, the particular sounds of a man who had never been a graceful morning person and had long since stopped pretending otherwise, to the chair that scraped, the coffee pot that was always handled slightly too heavily, the quiet sound of someone moving around a space they had inhabited long enough to stop being careful in it. She did not turn around immediately. She stood at the window for another moment, pencil in hand, and looked at the valley in its early light. The thing that should not have existed, that did exist, that she was part of in a way that was real and continuing and imperfect in all the ways that real continuing things are imperfect. There was a word she had been turning over for a while, something she had not had much occasion to use in Garvey's Crossing. Not because the feeling was new, she thought probably she had always had the capacity for it, but because the conditions for it had not existed in Garvey's Crossing in any form she could act on. The word was not romantic, not in the way that word was usually used. It was more basic than that. It was the feeling of a person who has finally found the right scale for the life they were built for. She thought about every person who had looked at her and seen what they expected to see. She thought about Damien's look, that slow, deliberate inventory, and she thought about what it had cost him to have been so certain of what he was seeing. She thought about Prentice at the bank with his soft hands and his sympathetic voice and his assessment of her insufficient collateral. She thought about the women by the fabric bolts and the men who didn't lower their voices. She did not think about them with anger anymore. Anger was useful, and she had used it, and it had served its purpose and could now be set down. What she thought about instead was the specific lesson their certainty had carried, which was this: the most dangerous thing a person can do is decide they already know what they are looking at. Because the world is full of people who have been underestimated so completely, for so long, that they have had the extraordinary opportunity to become exactly what they needed to become. Unseen, under the radar of the people who thought the matter was settled. That was not a comfortable lesson for the people who had done the underestimating, but it was a real one. And the most human truth in all of it, the thing that stayed with her past the strategy and the documents and the vindication, was simpler than any of that. It was that she had spent 28 years in a place that had already decided she was the end of her story, and she had been wrong to believe them, even partially, even for a moment. The people who tell you what you are worth are almost never the right people to ask, and the life you are capable of is almost never the life that the people around you, looking at you with their certainties and their categories, are capable of imagining. She turned from the window. Nathaniel was at the table with his coffee, the morning's first papers in front of him, looking like a man who had been up for 10 minutes and was only now beginning to function. He looked at her. "Anything in the notebook?" he said. She looked at what she'd written. 2 pages. The Eastern expansion timeline, a note about the seed yield projection she wanted to revisit, a question she'd thought of for Cable about the north fence line. "The usual," she said. She came to the table and sat down, and he pushed half the papers toward her, and she picked up her pencil, and outside the valley was getting brighter, the light moving down the mountain walls in the way it did every morning, finding everything it touched and showing it clearly, without preference, without judgment, the way light had always worked, falling on whatever was actually there, whether anyone had thought to look or not.